for song leading tonight, but it's good to see Guy here. Like I was telling him, we missed you, Guy. So it's good to have you back with us. So I'm going to start off with an oldie but a goodie, Amazing Grace, 129. And we're going to go ahead and sing the whole song tonight, just 1 through 5. So again, 129. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. And our next song before we have our opening prayer will be 852. Just thinking about this song on the way in, so thought we'd sing it. 852, we'll just do the first and third. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair, when the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Let us labor for the Master from the dawn till setting sun. Let us talk of all his wondrous love and care. Then when all of life is over and our work on earth is done, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Right, Matt. All right. Let's turn to Mark chapter 2. That's Mark 2. Going to be finishing up this chapter tonight. But here in Mark 2, we are beginning to get into some of the specific details of Jesus' ministry that took place in the region of Galilee. Now, among the things that Mark deals with in this chapter that we've looked at so far is Jesus' authority to do the things that he did during his ministry. We talked about his authority to forgive sins and the healing of the paralytic story. We looked at why his disciples did not fast as well. That's verses 1 through 22 of it in a nutshell. So as we reach verses 23 through 28 of this chapter, another area where Jesus' authority was questioned in his relationship to his disciples was in the area described in verse 23 of this chapter. The text there says, "And it happened that as he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain." We'll pause there. So here we have a scene set up for us. What's the scene? Okay, so that's the scene here. They're walking along, they go through these grain fields. It's the Sabbath. That's going to become significant. And what are his disciples doing? Okay, what's construed to be work? And what does the text tell us that will be construed to be work? Picking grain, picking these heads of grain. So they're walking through a grain field. There's grain. They're just picking the heads. Now, all these details are significant. So it's the Sabbath. They're going through these grain fields. But what Mark records Jesus' disciples as doing here, picking these heads of grain, it has its roots in something we read about in Deuteronomy chapter 23. We're not going to go there. But in verse 25 of that chapter, God, through Moses, tells his people that it was completely legal. They were allowed to pluck the heads of grain in fields like this one, like these grain fields. What they were not to do was take the whole piece of grain. just chop it up and take the harvest for themselves. God said, don't do that, but what you can do is pick the heads off this grain. So it's okay that the disciples are doing this. But Mark's point of emphasis from the context is not so much on what they are doing, it's on when they are doing it. When are they doing this, according to this verse? The Sabbath. So this is what becomes significant in verses 23 through 28. It's not what his disciples are doing, it's when they're doing it. So, in verse 24, the when becomes significant. The text there says, the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? So what's the question here? If you were to put this in your own words, what is the problem? Okay, they're picking grain on the Sabbath, but we find this phrase, not lawful. Does everybody have those same two words there? Not lawful? Okay. What does it mean when something is not lawful? It's against the law. It's illegal. So Mark is recording this question. Who's the question coming from? The Pharisees. And who are the Pharisees? Okay, they're part of the religious leadership. We've run into them before in our studies of Mark. Among the things the Pharisees were known for, what were they most known for? Does anyone remember? They were the teachers. They were sticklers of the law. You had the law. They were known for their following the law to the letter. But yes, as Jeremiah said, they were also teachers. So it's the Pharisees. They're asking this question. This is occurring on the Sabbath. So with that in mind, what we should also understand here is that in light of the fact that the Jews, well, let me ask you, I think you guys know this. What were the Jews not permitted to do on the Sabbath? Work. We know this. It was a commandment. We find it in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. So you have this commandment not to work. The question, if you're a Jew looking at this commandment that says you shall not do work on the Sabbath, I'm just paraphrasing, in the Jew's mind, well, what is work? That's the question that comes up. What qualifies as work? So this is the question that many of the religious elite, for lack of a better term, asked. Well, what constitutes work? So it is because of these things that here and on many other occasions, on many other Sabbaths more specifically, Jesus was questioned about what both he and his disciples did on the Sabbath. In the religious leaders' minds, some of the things Jesus did, some of the things his disciples did, qualified as work. Now, another reason the Pharisees believed that what Jesus' disciples to be doing qualified as work is because in Exodus 34, verse 21, God said that his people should rest even from plowing and harvesting on the Sabbath. So, with all that in mind, what's the problem the Pharisees have with the disciples picking grain, heads of grain? They saw it as harvesting. They saw it as work. Jesus, your disciples are working. Why are they doing what is illegal on the Sabbath? Is the question they're asking. Questions or comments on 23 or 24? Yeah, they're right. It's not work, and this is part of what Jesus is going to show, and he's going to answer this question that the Pharisees are asking, and he's going to answer this question in two different ways. And it's these two different ways that we're going to look at today as we look at 2 points, the word I like to use. from verses 25 through 28, where we're going to look at Jesus' answer to this question. The first way Jesus answers this question is with Scripture, verses 25 and 26. Then in verses 27 and 28, the second way Jesus answers this question is with a reminder of who the Sabbath was for. Guys, your hand up? Okay, I thought it was. So, after looking at these things, I think the application of this text to us, at least one, is going to be that we too must know how to answer these kinds of questions. Because even today, we will still ask, why are you doing this? We have to know how to answer those questions. And I think that's the application we're going to take from this, and we'll talk about that more as we get to the end. But right now, let's look at the text. We'll begin reading in verse 25 and go through verse 28, and then we'll look at the points. So again, Mark chapter 2, beginning in verse 25, we read, "And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he also gave it to those who were with him. Jesus said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" Okay, so again, we have this question that the Pharisees ask, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Jesus answers. Starts off with Scripture. In verse 25, we have the first of a two-part question. What does Jesus ask in verse 25? Okay, have you read about David? What about David is brought up in this verse? Okay, so this is a situation, something about David. By verse 25, why did they do what they did? They were hungry. Yeah. He and some people he was with became hungry. So he's setting up what a scene is what Jesus is doing. It's something that the Pharisees he's dealing with could read about. So the situation he describes here is one that we read about in 1 Samuel chapter 21. We're not going to go there. But in verses 1 through 6 of that chapter, there's David. He comes to a priest, and he asks the priest for bread for himself and some young men that he had sent off. That's who these companions are, some young men that he had sent off to do something. But what that scripture does not tell us is whether or not that occurred on the Sabbath. But even though that's the case, verse 6 of that chapter may imply that it occurred on the Sabbath, because in accordance with the law we read about in Leviticus 24, verse 8, hot bread was put in the place of what the text calls the bread of the presence. That's 1 Samuel 21. That bread had been taken away at the time David came to the priest. There was hot bread in its place. So if that David incident that Jesus is beginning to ask about here did occur on the Sabbath, the scripture Jesus is appealing to would be relevant to the situation that he's describing here in Mark chapter 2. Questions or comments on verse 25 before we get into the rest of the story in 26? That is curious. So he could have brought that up, but Jesus knows what he's doing. So, yeah, I get that would be true. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, that's another approach he could have taken. Anything else on verse 25? Okay. So verse 26 continues the thought. What did David do? According to verse 26. He and his companions are hungry. So what does he do? Okay. What phrase does Jesus use there? that the Pharisees used. And the two words, it was not lawful. It was not what? Not lawful. What does not lawful mean? Illegal, against the law. So he's using their language. Says, well, Pharisees, have you read about what David did? He got hungry, he and his buddies. Again, that's just my language I'm using. They go into the house of God. What's the house of God? The temple, or earlier in the Old Testament, the tabernacle. But still we're, under the Old Testament, you went into God's presence. Ate this consecrated bread. Does everyone have consecrated bread there, or is there a different word? Showbread? Okay, yeah, it's the bread of the presence, because that's back in 1 Samuel 21. But this was bread set apart for a purpose, in accordance with the laws we read about in the Old Testament. Who was the only ones allowed to eat this bread? The priest. David was not a priest. Therefore, Jesus says, it was illegal for him to eat this bread. But it wasn't just David who ate this bread, it was his buddies under him. So why is Jesus bringing this up in response to the question? That's part of it. Right. Right. So it was allowed. There are times when the law is set aside for the greater good. David, his companions were hungry. There was a legitimate need. But something else that's at play there. How did the Jews view David? Let me ask that question first. Very highly. Nobody questioned what David did at this time. So Jesus says, have you read about this? Part of his implication here is that you didn't condemn David for this. There was a human need. It supersedes what the law says. But we have to ask, well, how does this answer the Pharisees' question? What's the point Jesus is making here? The point Jesus seems to be making here is that even though what Jesus' disciples were doing violated what the Pharisees believed to be true about the Sabbath, the disciples still had the authority to do this. Because who are the disciples following? Jesus. So if Jesus says it's okay, regardless of what the Pharisees think. Right. Exactly. And right before this, we had the fasting incident. And Jesus made the point that he's bringing in something new, so the old fasting laws are getting set aside. Anything else on 26? Okay. So putting verses 25 and 26 together, one way Jesus answered the Pharisees' question is with Scripture. In these verses, Mark has shown that Jesus used Scripture to answer one of many questions that Jesus would be asked about whether or not it was legal by the letter of the law for he and his disciples to do something. As a result, like many other times throughout his ministry, Jesus would stand on the authority of the Old Testament Scriptures. At this time, the New Testament is not in effect yet, because Jesus is still alive. He's bringing things in. So the Old Testament still has authority in the way that it did then. But Jesus would show that ultimately he had the authority of God the Father to do the things he was doing. And as a result, his disciples would have the same authority. But Jesus doesn't stop there. This brings us into the second way he answers the question, and that's with a reminder of who the Sabbath was for, verses 27 and 28. So verse 27, Jesus makes the point. What does he say in verse 27? Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Very straightforward. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath? Okay, there's who rules it. That might be part of it, but what else? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay? Okay, that's true. Okay, that might be part of it as well. Now, in an effort to even add to this question, what was the purpose of the Sabbath? It's a day of rest. Now, is rest important? Okay. God knows that it is. What did God do at creation? He rested. What did he rest from? Creating everything. God did work, days 1 through 6. Day 7, he rests. God knows we need to rest. So he puts the Sabbath in place to give us that opportunity to rest. Now, today we're not under a Sabbath law, but the opportunity to take rest is always there. God made that possible for us. That's what this statement is about. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was for the benefit of man. Man was not created to worship the Sabbath day. That's what Jesus is getting at here. God putting this commandment in place wasn't just part of keeping rules. That commandment was put in place so that man could have an opportunity to rest. God could have left that commandment out and said, sorry guys, you got to work all 7 days of the week. But he didn't do that. He said, work 6 days. Here's a day you can rest. Because as human beings, he wired us that way for us to need those times of rest. And so he puts the Sabbath in place. Here's an opportunity to rest from all your work. But then you have the Pharisees. They started saying, here's a rule you have to follow. They missed the point of the Sabbath. Yes, they had to observe the Sabbath, but not for the purpose of keeping rules, but for the purpose of realizing what the Sabbath was for. An opportunity for rest in the same way that God rested on that seventh day of creation in the opening chapters of Genesis. So that's your sermon about the Sabbath for tonight. Anything else on verse 27? Okay. Well, we're not done. We're going into verse 28. What does Jesus say next there in verse 28? Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. The American Standard says Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, but it's the same point. Now, can anyone tell me what the Son of Man business is about? Does anyone remember? If not, that's okay. All right. Well, I'm going to tell you. The Son of Man title for Jesus that we run into that Jesus often uses of himself. It has its roots in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. There's an individual there that Daniel sees in a vision. He's called one like a son of man. This person was given a kingdom, an eternal kingdom where he has authority over all mankind. But that person is personified in Jesus. So here in Mark chapter 2, what does this Son of Man have authority over? Even the Sabbath. If this Son of Man has an eternal kingdom, authority over all mankind, that means he has authority even over the Sabbath. That's what this word Lord is about. What does the word Lord mean? A ruler, a master. So the Son of Man rules over the Sabbath. Now, how does that tie in with verse 27? No, it's not an easy question, but I'm asking it anyway. What does verse 28 have to do with verse 27? That's part of it. He can do whatever he wants on the Sabbath. In addition to that, he can determine how it's observed. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, when people looked at this commandment of don't work on the Sabbath, the question comes up, well, what is work? A person who's Lord of the Sabbath gets to determine what is work and what is not. From this context, Jesus, as Lord of the Sabbath, gets to determine if picking heads of grain is work or not. Context indicates, Jesus shows, it's not work. They can do this. So this is all about answering this question that the Pharisees ask. Here in verses 27 and 28, well, Pharisees, let me remind you who the Sabbath was for. Jesus has told the Pharisees that the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the reason Jesus is able to say things like this is because it is he who is Lord even of the Sabbath. So Jesus gets to determine if the Sabbath has been violated or not. In this case, it has not. Because there's a need, and the need supersedes the law. So when we consider everything that Mark has recorded in these closing verses of Mark chapter 2, the point we should be left with is that Jesus was able to answer the Pharisees' question about what his disciples were doing in this picking heads of grain on the Sabbath. How did he answer it? First, with Scripture. Secondly, with a reminder of who the Sabbath was for. So again, the application does is that we, too, must know how to answer questions that we are asked when we are doing the things that we do as followers of Jesus. Now, if you haven't already, you will be faced with questions for the things that you do in your service to Jesus. For example, somebody might ask you, well, why do you take communion every Sunday? Why do you think you have to be baptized to be in a saved relationship with God? Those kinds of questions. Our responsibility in that is to know how to answer them. Peter, he writes, be able to give a defense for the hope that you have. Part of that giving a defense is being able to answer the people's questions. We need to be able to show people why we have the authority to do the things that we do in our service to Jesus. These verses teach us that we can answer people's questions with Scripture. We can also answer them with a reminder of the true purpose of God creating things, such as the Sabbath. Any other questions or comments? Guy, will you close us tonight? Did you? I thought you mentioned that once before, right? Okay. Yeah. Well, and what was the second cousin's name? Jim Dykes. Okay. Well, yeah. Just continue to remember that in your prayers. And prayers about your job as well.